Hello, everybody. Is this thing on? I think it's on. Well, cool. Thanks for coming to the first great debate of the day. Again, my name is Marty, and so today we're going to be talking, as he mentioned, about publishers and Google and Facebook. For a long time, they've been considered frenemies, enemies, and everything in between. But I wanted to start off with a show of hand. The big question today is, will Google and Facebook be good or bad for publishers in the long term? So can I get a show of hands for who in the audience thinks that these two giant companies will be a good thing for publishers and journalism in the long term? Very few people, it looks like. So, and of course, raise your hand if you think that they're just going to eat away at media as we know it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess you've won.
We have a few non-participants, but it's, I think it's swaying on the more skeptical side. So this is how it's going to work. We're going to have 5 minutes for each, Alicia and Nick, for opening remarks. And then we're going to have a debate. And then after that, we're going to have more closing remarks. And then after that, you're going to be asked to decide whether or not you have changed or whether you think the same. So I don't know who wants to kick it off.
Oh, that's good. Thank you, Marty. So just as an interesting side fact, we're actually both from Sydney, Australia, but I work in New York and she works in London. So we're going to be
a battle of the Aussies.
We know each other's weaknesses. I know where she drinks, so she's in trouble. All right,
there might be some swearing. Be careful.
And by the end of this, I'll be speaking like an Australian as well. But we'll see.
So for me, the most important part of that question, which we're debating, is the long-term piece, because I think in the short term, a lot of media companies are going to suffer, and some of them will die. But I think in the long term, those that survive will be better off as a result of what Facebook and Google are doing. And I base that on the simple fact that Facebook and Google are reinventing the industry, and they're reinventing in a way which is successful. Not perfectly. There are some problems, obviously, but they're doing it well enough that they can steal an election, for example. So it's pretty effective. So given that these platforms are so effective at sort of reinventing media and advertising, I think that the big challenge is for all the other players to hang around long enough for the opportunities to present themselves. It wasn't that long ago when we all thought that Microsoft's monopoly was going to be unchallenged, right? They own the browser. They own the operating system. They own all of the productivity suite, and yet, they prove vulnerable. And part of the reason that these big companies ultimately prove vulnerable is because of their scale, and because of their success. And so I think that it's part of it is to do with the cultures that they create. When they get so successful that all of their employees become children, because they're shuttled to and from their apartments in San Francisco. They never have to feed themselves. They've never cleaned an item of clothing in their lives. Then you can imagine a moment when that sort of inward-looking culture starts to fail. So that's why in the long term, I don't think that these two big platforms will continue to have the monopoly that they have. And in the short term, all the other media companies are going to learn not just from them, but how to beat them. So that's what I think is going to happen. What do you think?
All right. Shall I refute that?
Yeah.
All right. So the question at hand is, media companies will benefit in the long run from Google and Facebook's influence over the digital ad industry. I can't see how anyone could believe this statement. One only has to have been alive and vaguely interested in global events in the last few years to have seen the impact that Google and Facebook have had on the entire world, not just the online world, and not even just the digital ad industry specifically. So the way I'm going to just quickly break this down is first looking at what the influence of Google and Facebook is now in the digital ad industry, assess whether that's good or bad for media companies, and then let's look at what the trajectory of that is going forward. And just to make this real for us, by media companies, I don't mean like just evil conglomerates. I'm talking about the companies that we rely on for news, like The Guardian and The Telegraph, companies that make us laugh, like BuzzFeed and Bored Panda, and companies that inform and make us think, like Vox and Vice. I think we can all agree that these are companies that are worth keeping around. So the first area of influence that I'll cover is that of content monetization, how publishers and media companies actually make money. As you all probably know, media companies rely on a number of different revenue streams, including subscription and commerce, but primarily they rely on advertising. So they've got teams internally that try to get advertisers to spend money on their platform directly, and they're also generally all integrated into programmatic exchanges so that they can use data to optimize what is shown and how much they pay for it. This is all normal and well, and this approach would work just fine if it wasn't for the fact that two companies account for, wait for it, 77% of all digital ad spend in 2016, up from 72% the year before. So that leaves 23%. 23% is split between every other publisher, blog, media company in the world, and also the ecosystem of all the ad tech companies that try to serve them and help them make money. So every other online company on the planet that relies on advertising to survive has to make do with 23% of the online ad spend that Google and Facebook haven't hoovered up themselves. And in the long run, will this get better for publishers? Not at this pace. It's definitely not getting better. Digital ad revenues in the US grew by 20% last year to $72 billion, which sounds great, but the IAB says that Facebook and Google swallowed 89% of that new growth. And another estimate, which is even more depressing, estimates that it's actually 99% of all growth in the digital ad spend industry was gobbled up by these two companies. So is this a good thing? Well, it means less money that goes to publishers, which means they start to go out of business. And that's exactly what's happening with online and offline publications closing, citing lack of ad revenues as their reason. And while it might be hard to feel pity for all those ad companies out there, less revenue to them means they don't get as easily funded, it means fewer entrepreneurs enter the space, and it means companies can't afford to innovate and build better ways for publishers to make money. All this does is further entrench the power held by Facebook and Google, creating mammoth duopolies with impenetrable barriers to entry. All this does is create a vicious cycle. The more power held by Google and Facebook, the more likely they are to build scale and technology that performs better than everyone else, and the greater share of all ad dollars they earn, which gives them more power, thus the vicious cycle. So in terms of monetization, Facebook and Google's influence is definitely not positive. Now let's look at a second area of influence, that of traffic distribution, which is how people actually get to your website. Here, Facebook and Google also have incredible influence. They are both not only media companies themselves, sucking ad dollars away from all the other online publishers, but they also are a major source of traffic for publishers. People search on Google and people discover on Facebook, and that's increasingly becoming the way people find and visit media companies. Parsley shows that Facebook and Google combined, ready for this, represent 80% of all referral traffic, and in some sectors it's even more than that. That's up from 73% the year before. So we can assume that this trajectory for the long run is getting worse, not better. Why is this a negative thing? Because it means publishers are highly dependent on Facebook and Google for most of their traffic and therefore most of their revenue. And it means that publishers end up spending more time optimizing their landing page load times and creating viral videos so that they can creep up the search rankings and they can trick the newsfeed algorithm. They do all this rather than actually building their own quality content, direct communities, and actual trusted brand, which is what they actually need to do in order to detach from the dependency on Facebook and Google. This disproportionate reliance on Facebook and Google for traffic means that they are more susceptible when Facebook or Google change their algorithms with disastrous and immediate results on their traffic and therefore on their revenues. So that's not good, eh? So my final point on the impact Facebook and Google have on media companies is not a financial one, but an ethical and societal one. What kind of world are we living in when our source of news and truth and our guide on what is important and what is trivial is driven not by what's best for society, but what will get them more clicks? We've already seen the impact on the world of fake news, but even legitimate media companies are compelled to create sensationalized headlines, to focus on salacious topics, and to publish as spontaneously as possible in order to win the online media war that has its rules of engagement dictated by Facebook and Google. All these three trends I've covered are not only negative, but their trajectories indicate that they're getting worse, not better in the long run. Facebook and Google are duopolies that are set to impact the future financial viability of publishers and media companies, set to make publishers even more reliant on them for traffic, and set to make publishers even more likely to bend to their guidelines in order to survive, impacting journalistic integrity and the quality of our political discourse.
Great. Didn't mean to cut you off.
Yep, that was 5.
But, so I'm trying to do my best to be a moderator, and 5 and 5, you know, got to keep it equal. Sorry.
5 minutes, right?
I come from Minnesota. Minnesotans are really nice, and we hate interrupting,
Oh,
but
just
you
say
gotta
shut
leave this
up.
fair.
Fine.
So this is all great. We have two very strong points on both sides. We have the skeptical side, and we have the optimistic side. And so, I'm going to jump in with a quick question here, but I want there to be some crossfire, so it's not just me going back and forth. So, but the first question I'm going to leave is for Nick. So you said it's going to be a good thing for the long term, but a lot of the publishers that I talk to are not happy with the current revenue that they're getting from these companies. They want at least half or more, and then we're seeing, even as they're getting more subscriptions, even with fake news, New York Times, Washington Post have record numbers, but now we're seeing Google and Facebook offer their own subscription services, and they're going to be getting revenue off of that. And so I'm kind of curious if publishers aren't happy and Facebook and Google keep copying on what's going well for publishers, how do they succeed? And is it up to the publishers to innovate, or is it up to advertisers that have the money to help them to innovate?
Oh, I think it's up to the platforms, and I think this is the point, is that there's two scenarios, right? And both of these platforms, and in particular Facebook, can collapse as quickly as they grew, right? Because you can reverse network effects as well as grow network effects. The success of these platforms will depend on them figuring out the supply side, which is the publishers and the media companies. They have to do it. And I know that they're thinking about that, right? So the first two things that they figured out was how to make a great user experience, right? And so regardless of whether we think it's good or not, most people in the world like these two platforms enough, to reach out and use it. But they can dislike it enough to leave them. So I'm not sure what solution you're suggesting, because you're painting a pretty dire problem. My point is that the solution will come from emergent behavior by all of us. All of us will decide whether we think it's good or not. And one of the things that the risk is that we'll walk away from these platforms if the content gets worse. And the content will get worse if they don't figure out how to compensate the publishers and the supply side. So I think they're going to have to figure it out. So in this instance, I agree with you. But I'm just saying that they don't have a future if they don't do that. So that's why I'm not worried about them.
I mean, it's a very convenient argument you've taken there, Nick, which is, yes, I agree with you, but maybe in the long run, something will happen, something will be invented that will save us.
It will have to.
Which is possible.
No, it will have to.
What's the collateral damage in the meantime? So in the meantime, we've got a ton of newspapers being closed, and even worse, I think, like quality news sources, which used to rely on paid newspapers and subscriptions, are now having to resort to sensational headlines and publishing very quickly before they've even validated facts in order just to game the system. And at what stage do we get so corrupted that not only do we have publications closed down, but we also have a corruption of quality news and the implication that it has in society? Can we wait? Can we wait for some future day? What's the cost in the meantime?
The music industry waited. And I think music's in a better place now than it's ever been. Now, the industry itself is not dependent on...
You think the world is better for some of the pop acts that are around, and the closure
There are more people making music now than ever before, and more ways to listen to it. I think that's a good thing. That's a democratic situation that didn't exist when your success as a music publisher was dependent on where you sat on the Virgin Megastore shelf. And I think something analogous is happening in media right now, and it's going to shake out. And we can protect legacy businesses, or we can wait till the new ones emerge. And I think the new ones will emerge because they will have to, and mostly because we have the choice. We're the users. I'm not using Facebook as much as I used to because I find it shrill and ugly. But I also recognize that if I grew up 60 years ago in a small town in Minnesota, the echo chamber I was in was a Lutheran church, where every little old lady would tell me what I should think and what I should do. It's not like there hasn't been echo chambers before. At least now I can choose my fucking echo chamber.
That's a good point.
See, my issue is also that in the meantime, very nice. My issue is also on the kind of antitrust and conflict of interest issues that we've got going on with both parties. So Google at the moment has set aside $2.7 billion ready, which is the largest fine that has ever been issued by the European Commission for antitrust measures, because Google has been seen to favor its own content destinations in favor of others. So here you have a company that is both responsible for how you discover and also offering alternatives to what you discover, which gives you a sort of a conflict of interest, which means are they actually there to help the publisher or their own network of sites? Same with Facebook. You've got here a company that measures itself on number of users, measures itself on the amount of engagement on its site, has launched Instant Articles, which is a way to keep you within the Facebook world, which monetizes, but universally publishers say that it monetizes much worse than when when a user goes to their own site. Again, here you've got a site that is rewarding publishers that give them more power and disadvantaging those that don't. You start to get publishers like The Guardian pulling itself out of Facebook entirely, and more like every publisher I've spoken to saying that Instant Articles hasn't quite worked for them yet. So you've got here a conflict of interest, which perhaps they might work out in the meantime, but still it's not great for publishers in the long run if by the time the long run arrives, we've got a broken world.
Oh my God, we're all going to die.
And I'll be out of a job because journalism won't exist. I'm kidding. Hopefully that's not the case. But so I wanted to ask another question to you. So thinking about like, your company and all these others that are smaller than Facebook and Google, but are trying to monetize for them. So do these companies have to come together to fight? Do all these Davids have to come together to fight these two Goliaths?
I'm actually very glad you asked that, because I actually found another tidbit of information that showed, again in the antitrust case, that just in July, you had a conglomerate of US news sites that have bonded together and asked for special dispensation from the antitrust courts in the US to ask if they can deliberately collude with each other against Facebook and Google so that they have some degree of strength. It's like getting a golfing handicap by permission. Similarly, again, yes, what Skimlinks does on the data side is we group together all these publishers and say, if you put your data in together and we share it in a way that we kind of keep in a really appropriate way, you as an individual tiny publisher can get the scale and targeting capability that a giant like Facebook and Google can have. So yes, I believe the only way that publishers and actually ad tech companies are going to survive is if there's a degree of, what's that awful portmanteau, the co-opetition, it's awful, but that is apparently a word, goes on so that you can help each other compete, which, I mean, A is a solution, but it would be better if I think Facebook and Google had from the beginning decided which side of the fence they were going to be in, a source of discovery or a destination, and actually acted as only one rather than acting as both as they currently do.
Sure.
God, it's so hard to hear what she's saying. What did she say? Sorry.
Yeah.
Just say yes, yes,
a lot of
I
echo
agree.
up here. So.
It is hard.
But so there's another question here. So do you want me to repeat that?
Yeah,
or?
just give me a quick
So she was
outline.
talking about with Google and Facebook.
Yeah.
You know, there are some of the smaller companies that are asking if they're able to legally collaborate or collude, or
Right.
that's a word in the news for a whole other reason these days. But if you know, I was asking if they need to come together to fight these two Goliaths, or
Right.
can these little Davids kind of fight this battle on their own?
Well, you know, I think ultimately the solution is, I mean, it feels like there's two debates going on here. One is about media companies, and the other one is about society, right? Because you feel strongly about that. The larger one, which is about society and how we operate as a democracy and how we can get news from us, I think is going to be mostly driven by us engaging in these platforms or not engaging in these platforms. It sounds like you think there should be some sort of regulatory environment or a compliance level, right? And I think either way, those two things, either top down or bottom up, will probably lead to these platforms getting less important. But for structural reasons, I think, right? Because I just don't think, I mean, Microsoft, as I used as an example, it seemed like they were invincible. But you've got to also recognize that what these things have given us. I have every piece of human information in my pocket now, which I didn't have 20 years ago. That is a miraculous thing.
The
right?
internet's great, but
And
our
also,
duopoly is great.
You know, we're both expats, and I'm connected with my family on the other side of the world in a way that was inconceivable 20 years ago, thanks largely to platforms like Facebook. So the good things are there. They know that they won't succeed unless they figure out how to please all parties, including the publishers and the media companies. Otherwise, they'll die, right? And so for me, it's like it's not a question of you know, the sort of politics of the collaborations and everything. It's really a question ultimately of us. We're choosing. We're either engaging, right? And it doesn't mean there won't be some compliance, but we need to be careful here, because if Hillary had won and they'd dug up that they'd found out some fringe left-wing organization had been seeding, you know, direct messaging to, or you know, a huge campaign to 126 million Americans smearing Trump in a similar way, then we would be having a different argument now. So we need to be careful to recognize the difference between people that we don't like and ethics that we think are right.
Well, one last quick question here, and then we're going to leave it open for final thoughts. But I wanted to ask, on that note, thinking of a lot of the fake news that we've been hearing about on Capitol Hill and in Silicon Valley these past several months, I'm kind of curious, do you think that has helped or hurt publishers? And also, we saw a few months ago with brand safety earlier this spring when a lot of major publishers pulled money from Google and YouTube, P&G, for example, for a little while, over their own safety of their brand. So I'm kind of curious, like, has fake news helped or hurt publishers? And is advertising the answer, or is there another sort of digital monetization that has to come in place of it?
Yeah, I mean, I reluctantly agree with some of what you say, Nick, which is that I do think that both Google and Facebook have already recognized that if they continue on this current trajectory, they won't have any content to have in their system because so many publishers will have been destroyed and the quality of the ones that remain will have been compromised. So I do think that they are going to start doing stuff. The question is, A, when, and is it going to be good enough and quickly enough? B, what's the cost in the meantime? And C, still, no matter with what they came up with, there's still going to be a way that the system is gained. And I worry that that's still going to result in media companies being affected and society being affected as a result of that.
Yeah, so I think the answer is that in the short term, it pisses us up. In the long term, so think about this. These technologies are so new, and the user base is catching up. So our literacy and how we decode all of these things is growing. So all of this fake news stuff, it's informing us about how to consume this media in a particular way. And it's also giving us a new value of maybe there's some things we should pay for, right? So either subscription model or whatever, or there are certain organs that we can trust more. There's always going to be levels of trust. Not everything I consume I'm going to trust, because some of it I consume because I think it's funny, right? But in the same way that, when Susan was up here talking about advertising, in early advertising, you could argue that it was just propaganda and people being manipulated. But as advertising became a part of our culture, we understood how to consume it, we understood how to decode it. We became media savvy in a way that our grandparents aren't. And I think the same thing will happen here. So the fake news will lose legitimacy or will be less effective, I think, largely because of our own literacy on the platforms and our willingness to actually pay for content.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. So, and then we're going to leave it. Now we have not much time left. I know we're going to rapid fire, but I want to leave it open for closing remarks. Nick, we started with you, so Alicia, we're going to have you start with closing remarks.
So I think I've already covered quite conclusively, hopefully, the degree to which Google and Facebook dominate how media companies make money, get traffic, and decide how and what to write about. All negative influences, all getting worse over time, and all likely to continue to get worse. Even earlier today, I spoke with the Chief Digital Officer of Condé Nast and asked him what he thought about this topic. He said what he fears is that as things go on, media companies will end up just becoming content creation arms and actually rely, rather than build platforms, rely on the other big social platforms as their publishing platform. That's good for perhaps some, but definitely not for publishers and their ability to exist on their own accord. I don't think any of them really want to become just content farms, and that might be where it's heading. The other thing that indicates to me, especially that the things are going to get worse, is GDPR. We're here in Europe. By May of next year, every company that retains any kind of personal information will have to ask for consent. That's really hard to do if you're an ad tech company, unless you have a B2C proposition that touches humans every day, which is Facebook and Google. It's likely that GDPR is only going to strengthen and increase the duopoly of Facebook and Google to the detriment of other ad tech companies and probably to the detriment of publishers. So finally, it's likely Facebook and Google are aware they're on a collision course to destroy not only the online media industry, but society as a whole if they continue on this trajectory. And it's likely that they will invent things to mitigate this, but not before more damage is done to our media industry and therefore ourselves.
All right.
Oh, very good, very good. Yeah. I mean, the only thing I would say is that I have faith in more emergent behavior, that we will choose what we want to use. They're a business. No one forced any of us to sign up to Facebook. No one forces me to search on Google. I do it because right now the value exchange is good. And there are things that are going to threaten that value exchange that you've mentioned, that I think are either going to change them to be better and to sort of include more people in their economy, or, and this is most likely, they'll unravel like every other big monopoly does. So and so I have a sort of faith that we'll figure it out, because that's what all of this is based on. It's based on millions of people making their own choices and creating wonderful things. And I just don't believe that there is. I would argue actually that they're less powerful than Microsoft was in their heyday. So there we go. Don't worry, you'll be fine. Go and have a beer.
Well, on that note, so before we go have those beers, we need another show of hands. Who has more faith in society and media and technology now than they did 25 minutes ago? Raise your hand if you agree with Nick.
Yeah, come on. I'll buy you all a beer.
Okay, so a
There
few
you
still.
go.
Hey, I'll
Still
buy
more
you a beer
pessimistic. And how about Alicia? Who is more worried today than they were a half hour ago?
Yeah, you're right. We're all going to die.
All right.
I think you have it.
I don't know, it's pretty close. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for listening. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And have a good day.